By the time I realized the sound was breathing and not the house settling, my hand was already on the closet doorknob. The hallway was so dark it felt like it was swallowing the thin beam from my phone's flashlight, leaving just enough light to catch on shattered picture frames and the smeared line of a muddy footprint. The air tasted like dust and metal thick in the back of my throat, every breath scraping on the way in. Somewhere behind me, a broken window tapped in the wind, a slow, hollow rhythm that made the whole house feel alive and sick. The breathing came in shallow bursts, ragged and uneven, like whoever was inside that closet had been crying for a very long time and finally run out of tears. My heart pounded so hard my vision blurred around the edges, but I couldn't make my feet move backward. I could smell mothballs and something sour, see the thin line of light under the door, pulsing with each tiny inhale on the other side. "Hello," I whispered, and even that felt too loud in the wreckage of my parents' hallway. Nothing answered just that trembling breath, a tiny whimper that sounded more like a wounded animal than a person. My fingers slipped on the knob. I hadn't even noticed I was shaking until the cold brass rattled against the latch. In that moment, I knew whatever was behind that door would change everything. It would tell me why my parents' house looked like it had been turned upside down and shaken. It would tell me whether my family was still alive or already gone. I took one more breath that didn't feel like it belonged to me, tightened my grip, and started to turn the knob. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Hannah Cole. I'm 32 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I thought I had finally built a life that didn't spin around my family's chaos. I live in Los Angeles now, in a one-bedroom apartment above a coffee shop where the smell of burnt espresso seeps through the floorboards every morning. I plan corporate events for people who make more in a weekend than my parents did in a month, and I work the kind of hours that make it easy to pretend you don't have time to think about anything deeper than the next deadline. But I didn't grow up in noise and traffic and neon lights. I grew up in a quiet Nevada town where the grocery store on the corner of Pine and First was the center of the universe. Cole's Market hand-painted sign, crooked as my dad's tie on Sundays, was where every birthday cake, Thanksgiving turkey, and last-minute forgotten ingredient came from. My parents, Martin and Diane, ran that store like it was a third child. In some ways, it got more attention than either of us. When I say either of us, I mean me and my younger brother Ryan. If you'd walked into that store when we were kids, you'd have seen me stocking shelves after school, lining up cans in neat little rows, wiping down sticky counters, doing my homework at the tiny office desk in the back. And you'd have seen Ryan sitting on the checkout counter, swinging his legs, shoving free candy into his mouth while Mom laughed and told him he'd charm his way into the White House someday. It wasn't that my parents didn't love me. They did in their way. But love in our house always seemed to come with a tilt just a little off-center. If Ryan forgot his chores, it was because boys will be boys. If I forgot mine, it was Hannah, you're the responsible one. We count on you. When Ryan dented the delivery van backing out too fast, Dad shook his head and said, "He'll learn." When I got a B+ instead of an A in chemistry, Mom sighed like it meant something was slipping. By the time I graduated high school, I'd already learned my role: steady, dependable, the one who didn't cause problems. Ryan was the one who needed help, who needed money, who needed understanding. If Ryan was a storm, I was the sandbag they stacked at the door. Necessary, but never the point. I left for Los Angeles at 20, telling everyone it was for college and opportunity. That was true, but it wasn't the whole story. The rest of it was that I needed to know what it felt like to live somewhere my worth wasn't defined by how quickly I could fix someone else's mess. I didn't slam any doors behind me, didn't scream or cut anyone off. I just drifted. Calls on holidays, visits once or twice a year. Enough connection to prove I was still a good daughter, not enough to get sucked back in. For a while it worked. I built a career, piled up 12-hour days, pretended the pit in my stomach whenever my dad's number flashed on my phone was just homesickness and not dread. Then a few months before everything crashed, he called late one night. "Hey, kiddo," he said, and his voice was thinner than I remembered, like someone had pulled it through a straw. "You busy?" I was, of course. I was standing in a ballroom surrounded by half-built floral arches and a client insisting every napkin be folded into the shape of a swan. But something in his tone made me duck into a hallway. "What's going on, Dad?" "It's your brother," he said, and the world snapped into an old, familiar shape. "Ryan's gotten himself into trouble again." I could hear the clink of glass in the background, my mother moving around the kitchen, the low hum of the store's refrigerator units through the wall. It sounded like my whole childhood. "What kind of trouble?" I asked, even though I already knew there were only ever two kinds, money and women. "Debts," he sighed. "The gambling kind. But don't worry, we'll fix it. We always do." I closed my eyes, pressing my forehead against the cool drywall. "Dad, you can't keep handing him money every time he screws up. He's almost 30 years old. He's scared, Hannah," my father said quietly. "He's still my son." There it was again, that tilt. Not malicious, not cruel, just a subtle shift that always left me on the side of "you'll be fine" and Ryan on the side of "we have to save him." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say, "And what am I?" The spare, but I swallowed it like I always did. We hung up with him promising it would be the last time and me pretending to believe him. Then I did what I'd learned to do best. I went back to work and pushed the whole conversation into a corner of my mind I rarely visited, until the calls stopped. First, it was just one missed call from my mom on a Monday afternoon while I was in a meeting. I saw her name flash on my screen and thought I'll call her back tonight. When I finally did, it rang until voicemail picked up. No big deal. People get busy. But then Tuesday came. 3 calls. No answer. Wednesday, I texted my dad. "Hey, everything okay? Haven't heard from you guys." The message went through. It just never got read. By Thursday, unease settled into my bones like a cold front. By Friday, when the store didn't answer and no one replied to emails, I started checking local news sites looking for anything: storms, power outages, an accident on the highway. There was nothing, just a quiet town and an unanswered phone. On Sunday evening, I opened the Kohl's Market Facebook page just to see if maybe they'd posted something about a vacation. Instead, I saw one short post that made my blood run cold. "Closed this week due to family matters. Thank you for understanding." My parents didn't close the store. Not for flu season, not for snow, not even when my dad had his mild heart attack 3 years earlier. Kohl's Market was their lifeline. If they'd shut the doors, something was very, very wrong. I called our old neighbor, Mrs. Bennett, my fingers stiff on the screen. Her voice came through tight and worried. "Hannah, thank God. I've been thinking about calling you all week. Why? What's going on?" "The store's been dark, honey, and your parents' car hasn't moved. But I did see Ryan there 2 nights ago, with a couple of men I didn't recognize. Rough-looking. They parked a black truck out front and left after a while." I sank onto the edge of my bed, the room tilting. "Did you see my mom or dad?" "No," she said softly. "Just your brother and those men." I stared at the wall long after we hung up the words. Rough-looking men echoing around the room like a siren I couldn't shut off. The old resentment and hurt twisted with something sharper fear. This time my parents' blind loyalty to Ryan wasn't just unfair. It felt dangerous. An hour later, I was shoving clothes into a duffel bag with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I grabbed my keys, my charger, nothing else. The freeway was almost empty as I drove out of Los Angeles, the city lights shrinking in my rearview mirror while the desert opened up ahead of me, black and endless. By the time I turned onto my parents' street, dawn was just starting to smear gray across the sky. Their front door was cracked open, nudged back and forth by the wind knocking softly against the frame like a heartbeat out of rhythm. The porch light was off. The curtains were drawn. I stepped inside and saw the wreckage of the living room, the broken lamp, the muddy footprints leading down the hallway. And somewhere ahead in the dark, that faint, uneven breathing. I followed it toward the closet at the end of the hall, my hand reaching for the knob, not knowing yet that whatever I found on the other side would mean my family, as I knew it was already gone. The gym floor smelled like dust and varnish, and the old fluorescent lights buzzed above us as if they were tired of being awake. I stood there in my plain navy leotard, hands clasped behind my back, listening to the coach call out names for the end-of-season awards. My parents sat in the front row, their faces expectant. Ryan sat beside them, swinging his legs, bored, and fidgeting his sneakers, tapping the metal chair. My name wasn't called, not for most improved, not for team spirit, not even for perfect attendance, though. I hadn't missed a single practice. I shifted on my feet, searching my mother's eyes for some sign of comfort, but she was already looking at Ryan, smiling at something he whispered. When the ceremony ended, the coach announced one last surprise, a special recognition for Ryan for being such a good sport during all the long practices he didn't even participate in. The applause rose. My parents stood and clapped proudly. Ryan grinned as the coach draped a cheap plastic medal around his neck. I felt my throat tighten as something sharp and quiet cracked inside me. Mom lifted her camera and snapped a picture of him beaming. She never noticed me lowering my chin, trying not to cry. Years later, I would still hear that applause whenever I doubted my place in the world. And that memory crept back to me the night everything began to fall apart, reminding me that pain doesn't start. The moment life breaks open, it starts in the small places where you learn to expect less. Growing up in our quiet corner of Nevada, I learned early how the emotional currents in our family flowed. My parents weren't cruel people, not by intention. They were hard-working, exhausted, and wrapped up in the kind of worry that clings to middle-class families who run their own business. But even in that everyday chaos, the imbalance was always clear. Ryan's needs were urgent, mine were optional. Ryan's mistakes were temporary, mine were warnings. I'd sit at the kitchen table after school doing homework, glancing through the doorway to where Ryan sprawled across the living room floor building elaborate castles out of blocks. If he accidentally knocked one over, Mom would rush in and reassure him it was all right. If I got frustrated with a math problem and sighed too loudly, her voice would float in. "Hannah, don't be dramatic. You know better." It was never said with anger. That almost made it worse. The tenderness they saved for Ryan created a quiet vacuum around me, one I didn't understand until adulthood, when I finally had the words for it. Invisible. Reliable. Second priority. I remember a Thanksgiving when I was maybe 10. Dad had asked me to set the table, and I spent nearly an hour folding the napkins into little triangles, lining up the silverware, and arranging the plates just the way my grandmother used to do. When I stepped back proud of myself, I heard laughter from the living room. Ryan, then only 7, had knocked over a tray of hors d'oeuvres, and Mom was doubled over, unable to stop giggling. Dad shook his head fondly. By the time they came into the dining room, they barely looked at what I had done. Mom moved 2 settings without noticing how carefully I'd placed them. Dad simply nodded and asked if I'd checked on Ryan. That became a pattern, me creating order, them praising chaos, me anticipating needs, them celebrating spontaneity. It wasn't malicious. It simply never occurred to them that I needed affirmation too. School didn't change things. If anything, it proved the pattern even more clearly. When I brought home a straight A report card, my dad would say, "Good job, kiddo. I knew you could do it." Ryan's C- in history was treated like a national event. They sat with him at the table for hours, going over flashcards as if studying for a final that would determine the fate of the country. When he raised his next grade by a single letter, they celebrated with dinner at his favorite restaurant. I quietly finished my homework at home. By the time I reached high school, I had carved out a quiet identity for myself, helpful, competent, never demanding. I worked at Cole's Market every afternoon, learning the rhythm of the place as if it were an extension of my own body. I knew which customers liked their cold cuts thin, which families would stretch their budget by counting every coupon, which regulars needed a warm smile to soften the loneliness in their eyes. Sometimes I wondered if my parents loved the version of me that made their lives easier, more than they loved the person I was outside of that role. The truth settled into me slowly like sediment in water. I became the one they didn't worry about, the one who didn't take up space, the one who made room for others. When Ryan got in trouble in high school, caught drinking with older kids in an empty parking lot, my parents spent days fretting over his reputation, his future, his potential. When I overheard them whisper that I was such a good girl, I knew it wasn't meant as praise. It was a consolation, a reassurance, a promise that I would not need from them what Ryan did. And because of that, I learned how to swallow my disappointments before they rose to the surface. I learned not to ask for help, even when I needed it. I learned to show them I was fine, even when the truth sat heavy on my chest. When I turned 18 and told my parents I had been accepted into a college in Southern California, the reactions were a study in contrast. Mom hugged me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Dad said he was proud, but he also asked who was going to help with the store during rush weeks. Ryan rolled his eyes and asked if he could have my bedroom after I left. No one asked if I was scared or excited or ready. I left town 2 months later with a single cardboard box of clothes and a growing certainty that distance was the only way to find out who I was beyond the orbit of my family. Los Angeles became a kind of self-rescue. I built a life filled with deadlines, meetings, and the constant hum of ambition that the city runs on. No one there knew me as the girl who filled in the cracks left by everyone else. Still, the old patterns didn't disappear. When Ryan called asking for money, I sent what I could. When Mom needed help understanding her new phone plan, I took the long calls. When Dad told me things were a little tight at the store again, I sent what I could spare, even if it meant skipping dinner out for a week. I never volunteered to come home, but I never said I didn't want to. I lived in a state of polite distance like a daughter whose love was reliable but never urgent. And that's the thing about old wounds, they don't stop bleeding just because you've learned to bandage them in silence. I told myself I had accepted my role. I told myself that families are complicated and that some children are meant to shine while others hold the flashlight. But the truth was, every time my parents called about Ryan, a small part of me clenched in that same place where the plastic metal once dug into my chest. I reminded myself that love isn't always measured equally. I reminded myself that my parents did the best they could. But deep inside, I knew the reason I never pushed back. I was afraid that if I did, I would lose whatever little place I had left in that family. And because of that fear, I excused things I should have questioned. I softened truths that deserved to be spoken with a sharper edge. I pretended Ryan's problems were separate from me, even though every disaster he created eventually found its way back to my doorstep. I thought I'd escaped all of it when I moved away, but the truth is, I carried those early lessons into every corner of my adult life. I learned to keep my accomplishments quiet so I wouldn't overshadow anyone. I learned to take on extra work so others wouldn't have to. I learned that if I didn't speak up, no one would ask if something was wrong. I built my independence on a foundation poured from years of feeling like the invisible one, and when the nights grew long and the city lights flickered outside my window, I felt the tug of the past, reminding me that I'd learned to survive by making myself small. So when the calls stopped, when the silence began stretching thin and sharp across my days, I fell into old habits. I waited. I rationalized. I told myself not to overreact. I told myself that my parents were fine, that they were busy, that Ryan probably needed something again, and they were helping him. I didn't allow myself to consider the truth. The truth that I had been carrying for years without wanting to look at it straight on. That the imbalance in our family didn't just hurt feelings. It shaped decisions. It created blind spots. It set people up for heartbreak. And when I finally drove back to my hometown and stepped inside that house, seeing the destruction, the overturned furniture, the silence settling into the corners like dust, I understood something that chilled me far deeper than the cold air in that living room. This didn't start last week. This didn't start with my parents not answering the phone. This didn't even start with Ryan showing up at the store with men who had the wrong kind of hunger in their eyes. This was the harvest of seeds planted long before any of us understood what they would grow into. As I stood there in that broken hallway listening to Jace's faint breathing from behind the closet door, a realization began taking shape inside me. Slow, heavy, undeniable. Something about the past was connected to whatever had just happened in that house, and in the next few hours, I was going to learn exactly how deep those roots went. The envelope was wedged beneath the corner of Dad's ledger, its edges curled like someone had gripped it too tightly before shoving it into the drawer. I hadn't meant to find it. I was only trying to steady myself on the edge of his desk, but my elbow bumped the drawer open just enough for the gold flap to peek through. My name, Hannah, was written in a hurried scrawl, the ink pressed so hard it bled through the paper. My fingers shook as I pulled it out. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the desk lamp the police had set up its harsh white light, making every dust mote glitter like something alive. I slid a thumb beneath the flap, the glue cracking softly. The paper inside felt warm, like it had been held recently, even though I knew that was impossible. As I unfolded the page, something slipped out, a small photograph. It fluttered to the desk. The picture showed Ryan younger, smiling proudly at Mom and Dad outside Cole's Market. His arm was slung around Dad's shoulder. Dad wasn't smiling. Not really. Not the way he used to. Panic sat tight in the corners of his eyes. My gaze dropped to the letter. Dad's handwriting wavered across the page. The first line nearly buckled my knees. "If you're reading this, things have gone too far." I read the words again, even though my eyes already burned. And then I kept reading because I had to. The room felt colder with every sentence. By the time I reached the end, my hand had started trembling so badly, the letter almost slipped through my fingers. A soft thud sounded behind me, a framed picture falling from a shelf, disturbed by the air or by something else. I didn't turn. I stood rooted to the floor, staring at Dad's signature, the ink smudged like he'd written it in a rush, or maybe with shaking hands. And a single truth rose inside me. With the force of a punch, Mom and Dad hadn't disappeared. They'd been living in fear. Fear of Ryan. Fear of what he had become. I exhaled shakily, lowering the letter to the desk as the weight of everything pressed in on me. I wasn't prepared for this. I wasn't prepared for any of it. But I knew one thing: I couldn't pretend anymore. What I had found changed everything. For a long moment, I just stood there, letting the shock settle, letting the room sharpen into focus around me again. That letter wasn't an accident. Dad hadn't written it as a passing thought. He had written it because he knew something was coming, and because he knew I was the only one who might understand what had been building for years. The paper trembled between my fingers as I lifted it again. Reading it a second time hurt more than the first. Each sentence peeled back another layer of truth, truth I'd refused to see, truth my parents had hidden to protect a son who had stopped caring about anyone but himself. Dad wrote about sleepless nights, about knocks on the door long after closing, about men who watched the store from across the street. He wrote about Mom crying in the back office, begging him to stop helping Ryan. He wrote about debts that weren't hundreds anymore, but thousands money Ryan claimed he needed to survive, money he said he'd pay back, but never did. And the worst part was a single line tucked halfway down the page. "He threatened us, Hannah." And he meant it. I felt something deep inside me twist a place I'd kept carefully compartmentalized for years. My parents, the same people who'd scolded me for being 5 minutes late to curfew, had faced violence in the home I grew up in. And they hadn't told me. Not because they didn't trust me, but because they didn't want to worry me. Or maybe because they still believed Ryan could be saved. A bitter taste rose in my mouth. It was the same bitterness I'd swallowed all my life, the unspoken knowledge that love in our family had always bent toward Ryan, even when it hurt everyone else. My father ended his letter with something that made my eyes sting. "Please take care of Lucas. He's innocent in all of this. And forgive us, we failed to protect you both from him. Lucas, Jace. Lucas, my nephew, the little boy I'd carried from that closet." The letter confirmed what my heart already feared. Whatever had happened in that house, he had seen far too much. I folded the letter carefully, though my hands shook. My mind felt like it was splitting in two, part of me shattering under the weight of betrayal, the other part burning with a fire I hadn't felt in years. I'd spent so much of my life trying not to rock the boat, trying not to inconvenience anyone, trying to be the reliable daughter who didn't need saving. But standing in Dad's study, surrounded by the wreckage of everything they had tried and failed to keep intact, I felt a shift so deep, it felt almost physical. I couldn't protect Ryan anymore. I couldn't soften this. I couldn't pretend my family was anything other than broken by the very person they had spent their whole lives protecting. The letter had given me more than answers. It had given me a direction. Detective Lawson returned from another room, his expression cautious, as if he could feel the storm brewing behind my silence. He asked if I was all right. I nodded, even though nothing about me was steady. I handed him the letter with fingers that didn't feel like mine. He read through it once, jaw tightening with every line. When he finished, he placed it on the desk gently, the way someone handles evidence that matters. "Hannah," he said softly, "this changes things. This gives us motive, timeline, and pattern." Pattern. The word landed like a stone, because that was exactly what this was, a pattern that had started when we were children and had spiraled all the way into tragedy. All those years my parents had insisted Ryan just needed another chance. All those years I'd been told to be patient, to understand, to forgive. They had all led to this moment. Detective Lawson told me they had tracked Ryan's car to a rundown motel outside town. He told me they were preparing to move in soon. He told me he wanted me far away from that scene. But all I heard was Dad's handwriting echoing in my mind, those final lines carved like scars into the paper. "We're scared, Hannah. If anything happens to us, take care of Lucas." That was a call I couldn't ignore. I sank into Dad's old chair, my breath shaky. The leather creaked beneath me, the same sound it made when he used to lean back after long days at the store. I looked around the study, the shelves he'd built by hand, the faded photo of my mom laughing in the snow, the jar of pens with bite marks from years ago. This room had been a sanctuary. Now it was an archive of warnings I'd never seen. As the detective stepped out to brief his team, I let myself breathe for the first time since opening the letter. The truth unfurled in me slowly, painfully. My parents hadn't kept me in the dark because they didn't trust me. They'd kept me in the dark because they didn't want me growing up afraid of my own brother. And still they had loved him right into the hands of the men he owed, loved him into making decisions that spiraled out of control, loved him until the very end, even when he threatened them, even when he brought danger to their front door. I stood up suddenly, the legs of the chair scraping across the floor. I walked to the window overlooking the small backyard where Mom used to hang laundry and Dad used to tend to his tomato plants. Everything looked the same, yet every inch of it felt contaminated by what I now understood. The patterns I'd spent a lifetime ignoring had finally revealed their full shape, and I could no longer pretend that forgiveness was the same as love. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. I could hear Detective Lawson's voice from the hallway, the low murmur of officers preparing to move. The air felt charged, like something was shifting, like something was finally breaking open after years of being held too tightly. I pressed my palm against the cold window pane. In that moment, the decision crystallized inside me with the clarity of lightning. I was done being the quiet one. I was done waiting for someone else to step in. I was done pretending Ryan's destruction wasn't my business. If the police were going to confront him tonight, then I would be there. Not to fight, not to forgive, but to finally face the brother whose shadow had defined my entire life. I turned from the window, grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair, and walked down the hallway with a steady stride. Lucas was safe, my parents were gone, and there was only one thing left to do. By the time I stepped onto the front porch and saw the squad cars lining the street, I already knew, the moment the sun set tonight, nothing in my family would ever be the same again. The motel room door slammed open so hard it rattled the thin walls, and every head in that dim hallway turned toward us. Officers surged in first flashlights, sweeping across stained carpets and peeling wallpaper. I stepped in behind them, my breath sharp and cold in my chest. Ryan stood near the bed, startled mid-movement, a duffel bag still unzipped at his feet. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and sweat. "Don't," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos as he reached for the bag. "Don't take another step." He froze. His eyes found mine. For a second, his mouth parted like he might speak, but I didn't give him the chance. I lifted the folder I'd brought, the one I'd pulled from Dad's study, and emptied its contents across the cracked dresser. The letter, the photo, the receipts, the scribbled notes in Dad's handwriting, they scattered across the cheap wood like falling leaves. "This," I said, my voice steady, even as my throat tightened, "is what you did." The officers stopped moving. Even the air seemed to pause. Ryan's eyes flicked to the papers, recognition dawning in a slow, sickening wave, and then the color drained from his face. But let me take you into the hours that led us to this doorway and how the truth I carried forced this moment into existence. After leaving the house with Dad's letter still burning in my hands, I stayed close to Detective Lawson as his team prepared to move in on the motel. Every breath felt like gravel in my chest, but beneath that pain was something else, a cold determination I'd never felt before. For years I had waited, hoped, rationalized. But grief has a way of turning hesitation into resolve, especially when truth has nowhere left to hide. I went back to my parents' house, walking room to room, carefully gathering what little pieces of clarity remained. The study held the most. Dad had never been organized, but he'd been meticulous about recording details: who visited the house, what time they came, who called, what was said. He had tried to create order in a life that was unraveling. That night, surrounded by silent walls and overturned furniture, I followed the breadcrumbs he'd left. I found a folder tucked beneath a stack of old tax forms, stuffed with handwritten notes in Mom's tidy cursive and Dad's shakier scrawl. Several pages were dated within the last month records of money withdrawn without explanation, surveillance camera footage missing from the store, a scribbled note that read, "He took the safe key again." It was more than financial strain. It was a pattern of manipulation, a history of small thefts disguised as emergencies of empty promises followed by new disasters. And worst of all, we had proof someone had intentionally removed the store's security drive. The box was empty. The log showed it had been unplugged 2 days before my parents disappeared. Only one person knew where that drive was kept: Ryan. As the evidence piled up, something in me shifted. This wasn't just about debts or fear or loyalty. This was about a brother who had been stealing pieces of our parents long before he ever raised a hand to them. By the time Detective Lawson told me they'd located Ryan's car, I knew I couldn't stay behind. Too much had been buried already. Too many years lost to excuses. I needed to stand there in front of him and make him face the truth he'd been running from his entire life. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but because this was the last thing I owed my parents, and the first thing I owed myself. The motel was one of those roadside places with flickering signs and doors that never fully closed. Officers moved in with careful precision. The hallway smelled like mildew and stale air. Every step echoed with a tension so sharp I felt it in my teeth. When the door burst open and Ryan was pulled into sight, time seemed to stretch thin. His face was gaunt, his hair matted, his eyes bloodshot. This wasn't the charming brother I'd grown up with. This was someone hollowed out, someone eaten alive by the choices he couldn't stop making. The folder in my hands felt heavy. I knew exactly what I was about to do, and I knew the room wouldn't leave anyone untouched. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply let the papers fall and watched the truth scatter across the fake wood dresser. Ryan's voice cracked first. "Liv, what is this?" "The truth," I said. "All of it." He stared at Dad's letter like it was a ghost. "You went through their things. They're dead. Ryan." My voice finally broke through its armor. "I'm trying to understand why." He flinched. It was the first honest reaction I'd seen from him in years. His shoulders slumped, and he braced himself against the wall like he needed it to stay upright. One of the officers stepped forward. "Mr. Cole, we need you to sit down." But Ryan didn't. He looked at me instead. "You don't understand. I didn't mean for anything to happen." "You never do," I said. "That's the problem." He opened his mouth again, but this time I reached into the folder and pulled out the final piece, the small thumb drive I'd found tucked in Dad's filing cabinet, wrapped inside a page torn from a notebook. It wasn't the store's surveillance drive. It was something else entirely. "Do you want to explain this?" I asked. Ryan's eyes widened. "Where did you get that Dad's study?" I said. "He hid it." "From you." The detective stepped forward, taking the drive gently. "What's on it?" I swallowed hard. "I didn't know until an hour ago." Ryan closed his eyes. "Liv, stop, don't." But it was too late. Detective Lawson plugged the drive into a laptop he'd brought, the screen lit with a folder of files, timestamps corresponding to nights Mom and Dad said Ryan had come by the house. When Lawson clicked the first clip, the room filled with audio, grainy but unmistakable. Ryan's voice, angry, desperate, threatening. "You owe them nothing," Mom's voice said, frightened but firm. "You think they'll let me walk away," Ryan shouted. "You think I won't pay for this?" Dad's voice cut in next, trembling. "You're not selling the store, Ryan." "We already told you I don't care," Ryan screamed. "I need that money. I'll get it one way or another." The audio dissolved into the sound of something breaking a struggle, Mom gasping, then the clip ended. The room went silent. The officers froze. Detective Lawson's jaw locked. Ryan stared at the screen as if watching a version of himself he didn't recognize. His voice cracked. "It was just a fight. Dad grabbed me. I wasn't thinking." "That's not the worst part," I said quietly. Every head turned toward me. I reached for the envelope one last time and pulled out a bank statement printed from my father's account, an account I didn't know he had. The withdrawals were massive, and the signature line, it wasn't Dad's, not even close. The detective took it from my hand. His eyes scanned the bottom. "This is forged." Ryan's breath caught. I felt something cold and steady slip into my voice. "You stole from them, Ryan. You drained the account they were using to pay off the mortgage. You signed Dad's name. And when they figured it out, you threatened them." "No," Ryan whispered, shaking his head wildly. "No, I didn't. I needed time." "You erased their messages," I said. "You took the security drive. You deleted the call logs on Mom's phone. You tried to keep me from finding out what was happening." My words hit him like blows. He pressed a trembling hand to his forehead. "You don't understand those men. They said they'd kill me if I didn't pay, and instead of facing them," I said softly, "you handed them our parents." His knees buckled. The officers caught him before he hit the floor. Detective Lawson's voice was low and unyielding. "Ryan Cole, you are under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of justice. And depending on what else we uncover tonight, there may be more." Ryan didn't fight. He didn't shout. He just stared at me, hollow and broken. "Liv," he whispered, "I never meant for you to see any of this." I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't look away. "That's the problem, Ryan. You never meant for anyone to see what you've really been doing." The officers lifted him carefully, guiding him toward the door. The hallway lights flickered above us, casting long shadows across the stained carpet. I watched my brother, the boy who used to chase fireflies with me in our backyard, disappear under the weight of his own choices. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel responsible for holding him up. The detective lingered beside me. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "I think this is the first time I've ever told the truth out loud." He touched my shoulder gently, then stepped away to oversee the transfer. I stood alone in the doorway for a long moment, letting the motel's cold air wash over me. Behind me, the room was frozen in silence, the spilled papers, the scattered evidence, the remnants of a family broken by secrets. Ahead of me, officers moved with quiet certainty, their radios buzzing softly. I took one more breath, stepped into the hallway, and let the door fall shut behind me. It was time to walk away from the wreckage so I could finally choose something other than survival. When the motel door closed behind me, the night felt unnaturally still. The flashing lights from the squad cars faded as officers moved Ryan into the back seat, and for the first time in days, the world wasn't spinning. My breath came out in a slow exhale, almost unfamiliar in its steadiness. The cold air touched my cheeks, like a reminder that I was finally standing outside the storm that had swallowed my family. The hallway behind me was silent now, stripped of the shouting and the shattering truths that had filled it minutes earlier. Even the hum of the neon sign above the parking lot felt gentler, as if something heavy had lifted from the air. I stood there a long moment, watching the officers drive away, and realized the weight pressing against my ribs wasn't fear anymore. It was release. Something had shifted, and I knew I would never go back to the life I lived before that night. I walked toward Detective Lawson, who waited near his car. When he asked if I needed anything, I shook my head. There wasn't anything left to ask for. Not from him, not from Ryan, not from the past. But in the quiet that followed, something inside me finally opened, and I knew healing would begin only after I stepped fully out of that parking lot. In the days that followed, I returned to my parents' house with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The first step toward reclaiming something of my own was reclaiming the space they had poured their lives into. The house was still marked with the scars of what had happened: broken lamps, kicked in doors, the cold hush of rooms that once held laughter. I rolled up my sleeves and started cleaning. Not to erase what happened, nothing could do that, but to honor the people my parents were before everything turned dark. I scrubbed the floors until the wood grain showed again. I gathered Mom's recipe books, smoothing pages that had curled at the edges. I found Dad's old gardening gloves still hanging by the back door and placed them gently into a box I labeled Keep. Every step felt like stitching together a torn part of myself. Lucas stayed with me during those afternoons, coloring at the kitchen table while I worked. Sometimes he'd look up and ask where Grandpa kept the birdseed, or if Grandma's cinnamon cookies were hard to make. I answered every question with the same soft certainty: they loved you so much, and we're going to keep the best parts of them alive. When the time came to decide what to do with the house and the store, I chose to sell both. Not because they didn't matter, but because holding on meant living in a space where grief would never loosen its grip. The money went into a trust for Lucas, a promise I'd whispered to him the night we left the hospital. "You will grow up safe," I told him, "and loved in a way that doesn't hurt." Selling the store felt like closing a book my family had been writing for decades. I stood outside on the last day staring at the sign Dad had painted long ago. I thought I'd cry. Instead, I felt something calmer: gratitude for what that place had been and relief for what it no longer needed to be. Leaving Nevada wasn't a dramatic break. It was quiet, mature, necessary. I packed the car, buckled Lucas into his seat, and drove toward the highway with no bitterness, only clarity. Back in Los Angeles, our small apartment slowly transformed into a place that felt like home. Lucas's laughter filled the rooms in a way that softened every hard corner. He made friends at school, brought home drawings of houses with big windows and stick-figure families where he always drew himself, holding my hand. Some nights were still heavy. He'd wake from nightmares calling for his grandparents, and I'd sit beside him until his breathing steadied. The difference now was that he wasn't facing those fears alone, and neither was I. I found a circle of support I hadn't realized I needed. A coworker who brought over a home-cooked dinner on a night she knew I felt wrung out. My building's elderly neighbor who slipped me a note saying Lucas reminded her of her grandson. Even Detective Lawson, who called once just to check how we were settling in. None of them tried to fix anything. They simply stood near me with kindness, with presence, and that was enough. Slowly, the pieces of my life began rearranging themselves into something new, something gentler. I started working fewer hours, carving out evenings to help Lucas with homework or read on the balcony. I took a weekend class in interior design, something I'd always been curious about, but never had the courage to try while carrying everyone else's expectations. One afternoon in early spring, Lucas and I painted the living room walls a soft, warm cream. Sunlight spilled through the open windows, catching the flecks of paint in the air, and the two of us laughed at the streaks on our arms. When we stepped back to look at the transformation, Lucas reached for my hand. "It feels happier in here now," he said. He was right. It did. That room became our symbol of rebirth, fresh air, open space, and warmth where sorrow had once lived. I don't pretend I've healed completely. Grief doesn't disappear. It settles. It teaches you to grow around it. But I no longer feel defined by what my family broke. Instead, I feel shaped by what I've chosen to build. Lucas and I are finding our rhythm, two people learning how to trust the world again in small, everyday ways. Sometimes in the evenings, I'll look out over the city lights and think about the patterns that led us here. The silence I swallowed for years, the favoritism that carved deep grooves into our family's foundation, the fear that kept my parents trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. Then I remind myself of the truth I learned the day I walked out of that motel. Love doesn't mean sacrificing yourself to someone else's chaos. Love means choosing the future that protects the people who depend on you, even if that means letting go of the past. And so I'm learning day by day to build a life where both of us can breathe. A life where light comes through the windows without feeling like an intrusion. a life where the quiet isn't terrifying anymore. In the end, this journey wasn't about exposing my brother or losing my parents. It was about finally stepping into the space my childhood never allowed me, to take the space where I am enough, where I matter, and where the future belongs not to the ghosts of what once was, but to the choices I make today. And maybe that's the quiet truth I've come to carry. Sometimes healing isn't loud. Sometimes it's simply choosing to walk forward, one clear, steady step at a time, toward a life that finally feels like your own.